April 17, 1945, Bergen-Belsen, Germany. The air was cold, the skies overcast as British forces swept through the camp's decaying barracks. Among the captured Nazi soldiers and officers stood a young woman, her face once a symbol of Aryan beauty, now a mask of defiance and disbelief. Irma Grese, just 22 years old, was no longer the youthful enforcer she had once been. Her name, spoken in hushed tones among survivors, had become synonymous with terror, the Hyena of Auschwitz. As the British soldiers bound her hands and led her away from the wreckage of Bergen-Belsen, they could only guess at the horrors she had witnessed, and more chillingly, the horrors she had helped orchestrate. While Nazi leaders had hoped their final solution would remain hidden, Grese's face became the grim, tragic emblem of the regime's death machine. Her trial, just months away, would unfold as a stark reminder that sometimes evil does not present itself in the form of grotesque monsters, but in the faces of young women and men indoctrinated by propaganda. The world would soon discover how much of her myth was truth and how much was truly documented. This is the story of Irma Grese, the woman behind the infamous image, the beautiful yet brutal face that symbolized the darkest chapter of human history. Born on October 7, 1923, in Recken, Germany, Irma Grese's early life was shaped by the turbulent rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. As the youngest of 3 children, Grese grew up in a modest home where her father was a farmer and her mother a stern, traditional woman. Despite the familial simplicity, the weight of Nazi ideology slowly began to seep into the fabric of her upbringing. By the time Grese was a teenager, the influence of the Nazi regime had reached every corner of German society. Schools, youth organizations, and the media played their part in shaping the minds of young Germans, molding them into loyal followers of the Reich. At just 15, Grese joined the League of German Girls, a key pillar of Nazi youth indoctrination. The League, which aimed to prepare girls for roles in the Third Reich, focused on physical fitness, racial purity, and unwavering devotion to the Führer. As Grese's indoctrination deepened, she was exposed to the promise of national revival, the glories of Aryan supremacy, and the belief that she too could be part of something greater than herself. The propaganda painted a picture of women like her, strong, beautiful, and dedicated to the ideals of the Reich, enforcing Nazi policies that would forever change the course of history. But it wasn't until she turned 18 that Grese took a step closer to the heart of the regime. She joined the SS, the paramilitary organization that formed the backbone of Nazi power. The SS, originally founded as Hitler's personal bodyguard, had grown into an elite force responsible for maintaining control over occupied territories and enforcing the brutal policies of the regime, including the operation of concentration and extermination camps. Grese's induction into the SS was not unusual. By the early 1940s, the Nazi leadership was pushing for women to fill key roles within the concentration camp system. With the war raging and men being sent to the front lines, the SS found itself in need of personnel to oversee the operations of camps like Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and Bergen-Belsen. Women, according to Nazi doctrine, were ideal candidates to supervise other women in the camps. Despite her lack of military training, Grese's ascent within the SS was rapid. The camp system, designed to ruthlessly exploit prisoners for forced labor and facilitate the mass extermination of Jews, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and political dissidents, required officials who were uncompromising in their execution of Nazi policy. Grese fit this role perfectly. Her introduction to the SS was swift and brutal. The process began with a strict regimen at the SS training school, where Grese learned the basics of camp management. But this was not just a place for learning. It was a crucible designed to forge loyalty to Hitler, loyalty to the Führer's vision of racial purity. The SS drilled their recruits relentlessly, not only in the technical aspects of camp life, but in ideological loyalty. Grese learned quickly, absorbing the lessons of the SS, the importance of obedience, the supremacy of the Aryan race, and the absolute necessity of eliminating those deemed undesirable by the state. By 19, Grese had been assigned to Auschwitz, the largest and most infamous of the Nazi extermination camps. Here she would begin her work as a supervisor, overseeing the thousands of female prisoners who were forced into grueling labor. But her role was far more significant than mere oversight. She was one of the many cogs in a machine designed to annihilate millions of people. The decision to send young women like Grese to Auschwitz was part of a broader SS strategy. In the eyes of Nazi leadership, women could serve as both enforcers and symbols of the regime's vision of the ideal Aryan woman. Beautiful, strong, loyal, yet unflinchingly ruthless when it came to implementing the will of the state. Grese's beauty, which had been used to promote Nazi ideals, now became a stark symbol of the regime's contradictions. Auschwitz was a place of death, yet it was also a place where the human capacity for survival was constantly tested. Greece, the beautiful and efficient enforcer, stood as a reminder that beauty could be used to mask the darkest of realities. Despite her age and lack of military training, Greece was rapidly thrust into one of the most notorious institutions in Nazi Germany, the concentration camps. The distinctive SS uniform with its black tunic, silver insignia, and the unmistakable skull and crossbones on the collar was more than just a garment. It was a symbol of death, of terror, of control. For Irma Grese, the uniform marked her transition from a young woman indoctrinated into the Nazi cause to a key player in one of the most systematic and brutal campaigns of extermination the world would ever know. By the summer of 1942, Grese had been assigned to Auschwitz, the largest of the Nazi concentration camps, a place where more than 1 million people would lose their lives. The camp, located in occupied Poland, was designed to house, exploit, and ultimately exterminate Jews, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and political dissidents. Greece's role, initially one of administrative duty, soon expanded to overseeing the daily operations of the camp and managing the thousands of female prisoners who lived there. Auschwitz was a place where the machinery of death worked like clockwork. Prisoners arrived in cattle cars, sometimes with only a vague idea of their fate. Once inside, they were divided into two groups, those deemed fit for forced labor and those sent directly to the gas chambers. Grace's job was to help determine who lived and who died. She was part of the selection process, which took place as the trains rolled in, with her cold, impassive gaze watching the prisoners as they were sorted. Survivors' testimonies described Grese as an enforcer, someone who showed little to no sympathy for the suffering of others. One survivor recalled that Grese never blinked as she made her selections. She was efficient, ruthless, and unflinching. The horror of the selections was matched only by the efficiency with which they were carried out. Prisoners were chosen in seconds, with their fates sealed in moments that would determine whether they would work in the grueling factories of Auschwitz or be sent to the gas chamber. Yet Grese was more than just an observer in the machinery of death. She was active in enforcing the camp's brutal policies. One of her primary duties was to oversee the forced labor of the prisoners. Prisoners worked from dawn until dusk, often on little food, in brutal conditions, and with the constant threat of punishment. Grese, described as a capable supervisor, was known to enforce discipline with an iron fist. Those who failed to meet quotas or who were deemed unworthy of labor were quickly punished, often by being sent to the gas chambers. In Auschwitz, Grace's reputation began to take shape. She was beautiful, youthful, and calm, a stark contrast to the brutality of the camp. Her blonde hair and striking features were immortalized in photographs, which the Nazi propaganda machine would later use to portray her as the perfect Aryan woman. But the image that Grese would come to embody in the eyes of the prisoners was not one of purity or strength. It was one of terror, of cruelty, disguised as efficiency. Despite the brutality of her role, Grese was also a product of her environment. She was not the only young woman in the SS tasked with overseeing prisoners. Other women, indoctrinated in the same ideologies, became just as ruthless in carrying out their duties. The role of women in the concentration camps was pivotal to the Nazis' ability to maintain control over the camps and enforce their policies. Women like Grese were seen as the ideal figures to carry out the regime's aims. Strong, loyal, and unwavering. However, Grace's participation in the daily life of Auschwitz was far more complex than just following orders. The camp was a place where survival depended on a balance of cruelty and pragmatism. The prisoners were not just victims, they were tools, forced laborers, subjects of medical experimentation, and ultimately fodder for the extermination system. Grace's role in Auschwitz was integral to maintaining this balance. Her beauty, which had been used to promote Nazi ideals, now became a stark symbol of the regime's contradictions. Auschwitz was a place of death, yet it was also a place where the human capacity for survival was constantly tested. Grese, the beautiful and efficient enforcer, stood as a reminder that beauty could be used to mask the darkest of realities. As Grace's reputation grew within Auschwitz, so did the myth surrounding her. Was she merely an obedient cog in the Nazi machine? Or did she actively contribute to the cruelty that defined the camp? The line between the two became increasingly blurred as her role deepened. The iconic black and white posters of the Nazi era, with their crisp imagery and bold slogans, were designed to instill pride and fear. One such poster, featuring Irma Grese alongside other female SS guards, became a key piece of the regime's propaganda machine. The caption read, "Aryan strength, the women of the Reich." Grese, with her youthful beauty, was presented as the ideal Aryan woman. strong, loyal, and utterly devoted to the Führer. The Nazi propaganda machine was masterful in crafting an image of the regime's enforcers. Grese, along with other young women like her, was cast as the embodiment of the perfect Nazi. These women were presented not only as symbols of Aryan purity, but also as the enforcers of the state's will. They were shown as protectors of the Reich's racial policies, standing guard at the concentration camps where millions would perish. Grese's image was carefully curated, with photographs and films showcasing her in a variety of settings. She was often pictured alongside other women in moments that reflected both their femininity and their loyalty to the Nazi cause. She was a striking figure, her blonde hair and striking features making the brutality of her role seem almost unimaginable. But behind the propaganda, there was the reality of the camps, death, suffering, and the systematic annihilation of entire populations. After the war, Grese's image would become a key element in the portrayal of Nazi war criminals. Following her capture, the media quickly began to sensationalize her role. Photographs of her, taken during the war, would appear in newspapers across the world, with captions that highlighted her beauty and her role as one of the most notorious figures in the Holocaust. In the post-war years, Grese became a symbol of the cruelty of the Nazi regime. The media and historians would cast her as the beautiful monster, a woman whose attractiveness belied the horrors she had overseen. Her trial in 1945, where she was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, solidified her place in history as one of the most infamous figures of the Holocaust. Yet, the truth behind the myth of Irma Grese is more complex. Her trial, widely covered in the press, did little to separate the woman from the propaganda. While it was clear that Grese had been an active participant in the atrocities committed at Auschwitz, there was little focus on the larger context in which she operated. The Nazi regime, and particularly the SS, was a deeply hierarchical system, and the roles played by figures like Grese were not purely the result of individual malice, but were also shaped by the demands of the state and the indoctrination she had undergone. As the years passed, the legacy of Irma Grese continued to evolve. Her image as a beautiful, cold-blooded killer would become cemented in the collective memory of the post-war world, but the reality of her actions remained a subject of debate. Some historians would argue that Grese's role was exaggerated, while others would point to her cruelty as evidence of her complicity in one of history's greatest atrocities. This chapter will examine how the official documents from the trial and subsequent investigations provide a more complex understanding of Grese's role. It will focus on the discrepancies between the media narrative of Grese as a sadistic monster and the more restrained facts presented in the trial records and other archival evidence. The image of Irma Grese as the beautiful, sadistic executioner of Auschwitz became a powerful post-war symbol. But how much of this image was based on fact, and how much was the result of the media's need to create a villain? The reality of Grese's actions remains elusive even today. The small worn rations card, a symbol of the hunger that defined life in Auschwitz, is a stark reminder of the suffering endured by those imprisoned within the camp. Prisoners were allotted meager portions, thin soup, a small piece of bread, and little else. The card was both a means of survival and a symbol of the deprivation they faced daily. For the guards, including Irma Grese, these rations were part of the harsh realities of camp life, a reminder of the sheer scale of the Nazi machine's operation. In Auschwitz, Grese's actions went beyond the administrative duties expected of her. She was deeply involved in the daily grind of running the camp, overseeing forced labor, managing the workers, and enforcing the brutal regimen that kept the camp running. As an SS supervisor, her primary responsibility was to ensure the prisoners worked without complaint and met their quotas. The SS's goal was clear: to extract as much labor as possible from the prisoners while keeping them in conditions that, at best, kept them alive for just long enough to serve the purpose of their exploitation. In overseeing the work, Grese was known for her cold efficiency. Survivor accounts from Auschwitz paint a picture of a woman who was unbothered by the suffering around her. One former prisoner recalled how Grese would stand in front of the barracks, her arms crossed, her eyes scanning the laborers with a piercing gaze. When someone faltered, she would not hesitate to strike them, sending them back into line with little more than a stern look. Yet, Grese's involvement in the death factory was more than just ensuring that prisoners worked. She was a part of the selection process where prisoners were chosen to either work or be sent to their deaths in the gas chambers. Survivor testimonies describe her as a cold enforcer, who participated in these selections with a detached air. The selections were chaotic, often involving the separation of families, the elderly, and the sick, who were deemed unfit for labor. These individuals would be sent directly to the gas chambers, where they would meet their deaths. Grese's role in these selections was a key part of her responsibility at Auschwitz. She did not hesitate when choosing who would live and who would die, acting in accordance with the brutal logic of the Nazi regime. There were no moments of doubt, no signs of compassion. She was a cog in the well-oiled machinery of the Holocaust, tasked with ensuring that the process ran smoothly. The myth of Irma Grese, the beautiful Aryan woman, stood in stark contrast to the reality of her actions. The propaganda machine that had used her beauty to symbolize the strength of the SS and the purity of the Aryan race now faced the uncomfortable truth. Greece was one of the key players in the system of mass murder. Her image as a beautiful, young woman was intertwined with the cruelty she carried out. The tension between her outward appearance and her actions in the camp created a dissonance that would continue to haunt the narrative of her legacy. But how much responsibility did Grese bear for the atrocities of Auschwitz? Was she merely following orders, a product of the regime's training and indoctrination? Or did she actively choose to participate in the horrors that unfolded before her? These questions would be raised in the aftermath of the war as historians and survivors tried to piece together the truth of her involvement. While some would argue that Grese was simply a product of the Nazi system, others would point to her actions as evidence of her active role in the brutality of the camp, her involvement in the selections, her role in the brutal treatment of prisoners, and her indifference to the suffering around her all suggested that she was more than just an obedient servant of the regime. She was an enforcer, a person who believed in the Nazi ideals enough to carry out the horrors they demanded. The contrast between Grese's image as a young, attractive Aryan woman and her role in the brutal operations of Auschwitz raises the question, was she merely a victim of the Nazi system, or was she complicit in the atrocities committed there? The watchtower at Bergen-Belsen was a symbol of the camp's decay. The once pristine camp had become a place of utter chaos, overcrowded with prisoners who were dying at a rate unmatched by any other concentration camp. Disease ran rampant, and the survivors of Auschwitz and other camps were sent to Bergen-Belsen in the last stages of the war, where conditions were so dire that the Red Cross reported seeing piles of corpses stacked on the ground. Grese's transfer to Bergen-Belsen came after the Soviets liberated Auschwitz in early 1945. She was relocated to the infamous camp in the final months of the war. By this time, Bergen-Belsen had fallen into complete disarray. With Allied forces closing in on Germany from all sides, the Nazis could no longer maintain control over the camp. Inmates were dying by the tens of thousands, ravaged by disease, starvation, and the absence of any real medical care. At Bergen-Belsen, Grese's role was not as organized or systematic as it had been in Auschwitz. The conditions were so deplorable that the SS could no longer maintain the structure of the camp or enforce the same brutal discipline. Nevertheless, Grese remained a symbol of the Nazi regime's will to continue the system of forced labor and death. She was seen overseeing the remaining prisoners, but the reality was that there was no longer any order to the chaos. The brutality had turned from methodical to desperate. Grese's time at Bergen-Belsen was controversial. Some survivors claim she was more passive at Bergen-Belsen, a result of the worsening conditions of the camp and the imminent collapse of Nazi Germany. Others argue that she continued to exercise her authority, but that the camp's crumbling infrastructure and the collapsing war effort meant her ability to enforce the brutal policies of the Nazi regime had waned. As the Allies advanced, the situation at Bergen-Belsen worsened. The camp was overwhelmed, and the Nazis were struggling to maintain control. In April 1945, British forces liberated the camp, uncovering the full extent of the horror that had taken place. The sick, the dying, and the dead were left behind, and Grese was among those captured by British forces. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen brought the Nazi regime's brutality into full view, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about the women who had worked in the camps, particularly Grese. Was she a victim of circumstance, caught up in the Nazi machine, or was she an active participant in the suffering that took place within the camp's walls? Grese's role in Bergen-Belsen may have marked the final chapter in her involvement with the Nazi regime, but it also left questions unanswered. What role did she truly play in the disintegration of the camp? And how much of her past actions could be attributed to the collapse of the Nazi system? Following the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, Irma Grese was arrested by British forces. As one of the first female SS guards to face war crimes charges, Grese became a focal point in the post-war reckoning with Nazi atrocities. Her trial in late 1945 was a major event, symbolizing the global effort to bring those responsible for the Holocaust to justice. The trial transcripts provide a chilling account of the evidence against her, including survivor testimonies and documents that outlined her role in the atrocities committed at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. The charges were damning. Grese had been involved in the selection process, overseeing forced labor and participating in the abuse and murder of countless prisoners. Despite the evidence, her defense argued that she was simply following orders and that she had been an obedient servant of the state. Grese's trial became a point of focus for for the post-war world. The legal framework for prosecuting war criminals was still in its infancy, and the trial of a young woman for crimes as severe as those she was accused of raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of responsibility and guilt. Grese was ultimately convicted of war crimes and sentenced to death by hanging. On December 13, 1945, she was executed, making her one of the first Nazi war criminals to face such a fate. The trial of Irma Grese marked a turning point in the post-war efforts to seek justice for the Holocaust. But it also highlighted the complexity of justice in a world that had been irrevocably changed by the atrocities of the Nazi regime. Grese's trial was a pivotal moment in the post-war effort to seek justice for the Holocaust, but it also raised fundamental questions about the individual's responsibility within a totalitarian system. Was she guilty of the atrocities, or was she a product of the system she helped enforce? In the wake of Irma Grese's execution, her image was forever enshrined in post-war media. The photographs that once depicted her as an ideal Aryan woman, poised and beautiful, were now juxtaposed with images of her trial and execution, transforming her into a symbol of Nazi cruelty. The Hyena of Auschwitz was the term most commonly associated with Grese after the war, her youth and beauty now serving as a horrifying contrast to the atrocities she had overseen. The media's portrayal of Grese was sensationalized. Newspapers and magazines across the world displayed her image, emphasizing her role in the systematic murder of millions, while simultaneously reinforcing the narrative of the sadistic, beautiful Nazi woman. She became a focal point in the post-war reckoning with Nazi war crimes, but the reality of her involvement in the Holocaust was often obscured by the media's dramatic lens. Historians and survivors have long debated the accuracy of the myth surrounding Grese. Survivor accounts, which were often the primary source of information during the war crimes trials, presented Grese as a cruel and unyielding figure. Yet these accounts were sometimes colored by the trauma and the overwhelming grief of those who had survived the horrors of the concentration camps. The myth of the Hyena of Auschwitz was born from these testimonies, as well as the relentless media coverage that followed her capture and trial. However, a more nuanced understanding of Grese's role in the Holocaust began to emerge in the years following her death. Some historians argue that while she was certainly complicit in the atrocities, her actions were not solely driven by sadism. Instead, they suggest that Grese was, in many ways, a product of the Nazi system, a system that dehumanized both the victims and the perpetrators. Grese was a young woman raised in the Nazi indoctrination system who, like many others, was trained to see prisoners as expendable. This chapter will examine how the media's portrayal of Grese became divorced from the reality of her actions. It will also explore how the image of the Hyena of Auschwitz became a symbol of Nazi cruelty, a symbol that overshadowed the complexity of Grese's role and the broader context in which she operated. The image of Irma Grese as the beautiful, sadistic executioner of Auschwitz became a powerful post-war symbol, but how much of this image was based on fact, and how much was the result of the media's need to create a villain? The reality of Grese's actions remains elusive, even today. Official documents from the Bergen-Belsen trial, along with declassified reports from the British War Office, provide the clearest evidence of Irma Grese's role in the Holocaust. These documents, some of which were released decades after the trial, offer a more objective look at Grese's actions and the legal framework that governed the war crimes trials. The trial documents include testimonies from survivors, many of whom had witnessed Grese's actions firsthand. These accounts describe her as an active participant in the brutalities that unfolded in the camps, including the selection process, the overseer of forced labor, and the overseer of executions. Grese's trial was one of the first to address the role of women in the concentration camps, and it raised important questions about gender and responsibility in the Nazi system. However, the documents also reveal contradictions. While Grese was certainly guilty of participating in war crimes, there are indications that her role was, at times, less direct than the sensationalized media portrayals would suggest. Some of the surviving documents suggest that Grese, while complicit, was also a victim of the Nazi system, one who had been indoctrinated from an early age and placed in a position of authority within a system that demanded unwavering loyalty and brutal obedience. One such document, a report from the SS, indicates that Grese was often tasked with performing duties that were not as directly related to the physical execution of prisoners, such as administrative work and overseeing labor, but these duties still tied her to the system of exploitation and death that the camp represented. Other testimonies, particularly from fellow SS officers, describe her as efficient and professional, though still heavily involved in the decision-making processes that led to countless deaths. This chapter will explore how the official documents from the trial and subsequent investigations provide a more complex understanding of Grese's role. It will focus on the discrepancies between the media narrative of Grese as a sadistic monster and the more restrained facts presented in the trial records and other archival evidence. The official records and survivor testimonies reveal a more complicated portrait of Irma Grese, one that challenges the post-war media's portrayal of her as an irredeemable monster. How much of her cruelty was a result of the system she was part of, and how much of it was inherent to her character. The rope used to execute Irma Grese remains an unsettling reminder of the end of her role in the Holocaust's dark history. On December 13, 1945, she was executed by hanging, marking the conclusion of one of the first significant war crimes trials and the beginning of the Allied effort to bring Nazi perpetrators to justice. Grese's execution was symbolic, a statement to the world that even those who were once considered the Aryan ideal would be held accountable for their actions. But her death, like her trial, raised difficult questions. Was Grese's execution truly a moment of justice, or was it a necessary closure to a war that had torn Europe apart? Her trial and execution represented a crucial step in the post-war reckoning with the Holocaust. But they also highlighted the complexity of justice in a world that had been irrevocably changed by the atrocities of the Nazi regime. As the British soldiers led her to the gallows, Grese's execution was seen by many as an act of retribution, a way to give survivors some sense of justice. But for others, it was a reminder that justice was often incomplete, that it could never truly undo the damage done by the Nazis. The trial, the execution, and the subsequent debate over Grese's legacy reflect the challenges faced in trying to comprehend the scale of the Holocaust. Can a single individual be blamed for the horrors of a system as vast and brutal as the Nazi concentration camps? Or is the responsibility shared by the larger apparatus that created and maintained that system? Irma Grese's execution marked the end of a chapter in the post-war quest for justice, but it also left behind lingering questions about individual responsibility and the nature of accountability in the face of such monumental evil. The testimonies of Holocaust survivors are the final artifact in the story of Irma Grese, underscoring the lasting impact of the atrocities she helped to carry out. These testimonials, often deeply personal and profoundly emotional, continue to serve as a reminder of the human cost of the Holocaust. Survivors recall not only the horrors they endured, but also the faces of those who participated in the system that doomed them. Grese's face, once a symbol of Aryan purity, became forever linked to the suffering of millions. In the years following her death, historians and survivors would continue to wrestle with her legacy. Was she a product of the Nazi system, or was she an active participant in the regime's horrors? The truth, as always, is complex and multifaceted. Grese was undoubtedly complicit in the atrocities of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, but the degree of her personal responsibility remains a subject of debate. Some see her as a cold-blooded killer, while others argue that she was simply one of many young women who were caught in the machine of war and ideology. This chapter will summarize the facts surrounding Grese's actions, her trial, and her legacy. It will reflect on how her life and death contribute to our understanding of the Holocaust and the broader question of justice. Irma Grese's legacy is not just one of cruelty, it is a complex, painful reminder of the ways in which ordinary individuals can be complicit in extraordinary evil. Her story is a testament to the need for historical remembrance and the ongoing fight for justice. The memorial plaque at Bergen-Belsen commemorates the thousands who died in the camp, including those who were victims of Irma Grese's rule. This plaque, like many others scattered across Europe, serves as a reminder of the horrors of the Holocaust and the need to preserve its memory. The lasting impact of the Holocaust is evident in the memorials, in the survivors' stories, and in the ongoing work of historians who strive to document the full extent of the atrocities. In closing, the story of Irma Grese is not just one of cruelty, but of a larger historical truth. The Holocaust was not a series of isolated events carried out by a few evil individuals, but a systematic process that involved thousands of people. Grese's legacy is a reminder of the need to understand both the individual and the collective responsibility for the atrocities that took place. As we remember her story, and the stories of countless others, we are reminded of the importance of truth, justice, and remembrance in ensuring that such horrors are never repeated.